All right, today we're going to talk about conflict in organizations. So, according to Lawrence and Lorsch, 1967, in a study of organizational design processes, they found that high levels of conflict. They found high levels of conflict in very effective organizations, with very high investments in managing conflict rather than avoiding conflict. So, conflict can actually be a good thing. Well managed conflict often improves decision making in organizations. Nonetheless, research shows that managers dislike conflict and try to avoid conflict. Now, within organizations, there are different types of conflict that can exist. So, conflict can exist within a person. Role conflict, role ambiguity. Perhaps you wear several different hats in the workplace, and so that means that you play different roles, and your decision making is influenced by those different roles that you play. So you may be conflicted in your decision making based on those roles. Perhaps one thing that is good for one part of the organization and one role you play is not good for the other. Conflict can also exist between people, groups and organizational departments or divisions. This would be conflict across levels. So you have different departments within the organization that may not get along. Finally, conflict can also exist vertically between higher and lower levels. So, for example, your typical management and labor conflicts, where you have upper level management disagreeing with the laborers. Now, the stages of conflict according to Pondey are latent conflict. Latent conflict exists when conditions have set the stage for conflict, but this has not simmered to the surface yet. So there are the conditions for conflict, but the conflict isn't noticeable yet. Perceived conflict begins when people involved begin to sense that conflict exists, even though they may attempt to downplay it or deny it. So if you have conflict between people in an organization or in the workplace, and you can sense it, and maybe you bring it up with a coworker, and you say, "Well, clearly you don't really get along with so and so," and they might, "Oh no, I have no problems. I have no problems with that person." Uh, they may try to downplay it or deny it, but there's clear that there's a conflict there. Felt conflict emerges when individuals begin to feel its effects. So once something has come to the surface and they begin to feel the effects of tension, anxiety, anger, or practical problems resulting from the conflict. Manifest conflict involves open warfare, figuratively or actually. People or groups try to frustrate, harm, or defeat one another. This is a destructive form of conflict, where things get very personal. And there are three possible outcomes to manifest conflict. One group wins or loses. The conflict continues with destructive effects. Or managers and members effectively channel and manage conflict toward constructive ends. And then there's the aftermath of conflict. This is the stage after the outbreak of conflict when some alternative and its results become evident. So we have some kind of um, uh, ending of the conflict one way or another. So let's talk about suppression, escalation, and touch on resolution a little bit. Excessive conflict can induce stress, frustration, dissatisfaction, high turnover, absenteeism, and poor performance from employees. So excessive conflict can be a very bad thing for an organization. When you're interviewing for a job, you often uh, uh, wonder why the position is open, and you worry about high turnover. If you're in any kind of workplace where there's a large amount of turnover, that could be a sign, possibly. Not all the time, but it could be a sign of excessive conflict. Researchers point out that conflict can feed on itself. The use of charged language, bias in sending and receiving information, a tendency to interpret neutral statements from one party as negative or aggressive, the reduction of communication, and a formation of we, they, win lose perceptions of relationships. So you get an us versus them kind of feeling when conflict feeds on itself, and you start to perceive neutral messages, even neutral messages, as negative or aggressive. So this can happen. This can happen in our personal lives outside of organizations too. Perhaps you are fighting recently with somebody you know. You receive a text message or an email from them, and you read it in a tone that is aggressive when really it might not be. Uh, so so yeah, conflict can totally feed on itself. Now, when it comes to resolution, a lot of times we use third-party intervention. Third-party interventions and interpersonal facilitators try to resolve conflict by having a person. This is where you try to resolve conflict by having a person outside the group or organization help with the conflict resolution process. So, um, in smaller cases, a manager can try to resolve a conflict between two groups of employees, or in the larger conflicts between management and labor, this is where you can end up with mediation, arbitration, um, uh, mediation or arbitration resolutions to try and come to some kind of negotiated agreement, and some kind of resolution to the conflict. Techniques for resolving conflict often involve ways of controlling expression, hostility, and aggression to prevent the conflict from escalating. They usually try to provide a systematic way to uncover the nature of the conflict and discover the base for resolving it. So you'll see mediators try to do this. They'll work to figure out what the nature of the conflict is, where some form of agreement can be made, and try to get both sides to understand the point of view of the other side, and figure out what the wants and needs of each group are, to try and resolve the conflict without it escalating further. So that is a little bit about conflict in organizations. Thank you.